China had always assumed that the divisions among the four Quad countries would ultimately prevail and prevent this from becoming a more cohesive unit over time, both in strategic and foreign policy terms and potentially economic terms. But the big change has come with the new posture adopted by India, in particular after the Sino-Indian border clashes of June of 2020. And that, I think, has fundamentally shifted the game, brought the Quad countries much closer together, and now cohering at a summit level, a foreign ministers level, and at an officials level, beyond what Beijing assumed would be the case.
Also, you see a new US president in Joe Biden, who also sees this, it would seem, as a very strategic alliance to use to buffer China's growing influence and power in the region.
Well, the US administration under Trump had a similar approach. The Biden administration has sustained that approach. But I think two things have changed. One is that we now have a rational US president to deal with, as opposed to somebody who was kind of on a rolling roller coaster ride to somewhere, we were never quite sure where. And secondly, it is the changing posture in Delhi. To be frank, Tokyo and Canberra have long been supporters of this concept. But in Delhi, it has waxed and waned, and mainly, frankly, waned over the years. But the seismic impact on Indian domestic politics of the border clashes, which saw the loss of 20 Indian troops last year, frankly, was the game changer. And if you look carefully at Indian government statements, that's what's brought about the change.
Do you consider that Australia has been a pawn in China's efforts up until now to drive a wedge between the Quad partners with the sort of economic coercion that it's inflicted on Australia?
Well, the Australia-China relationship in part is a function of the US-China relationship. In fact, all American allies around the world, whether they're in Asia or Europe, at varying times come under different levels of pressure from Beijing. It's been going on for some decades. And so that's kind of structural and become more structural as the balance of power between Beijing and Washington, frankly, it gets sharper and sharper, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. So that's the structural factor at play for Australia. But there's another qualitative factor as well, and that is, frankly, the Australian government under Mr. Morrison's leadership predisposition to shoot its mouth off all the time. And that actually turbocharges what is already a pre-existing difficult structural challenge in the Australia-China relationship and makes it more difficult to handle. And in many respects, that's what's pushed us to the front of the queue in terms of Beijing's punitive actions. Now, I don't endorse those actions on the part of the Chinese government, but if you want to analytically understand why that's the case, those are the factors which have brought it about.
We're seeing, though, I mean, do you then believe the Quad is quite critical to Australia to try and protect itself from China's aggression and China's response?
What's required here is a deeply rational analysis of both the opportunities and limitations of the Quad. Ask yourself this basic question. If Australia found itself in a direct national security crisis in its own immediate region of the Southwest Pacific or Southeast Asia, would it at that point rely upon either Japan or India to come to its military assistance? Answer, not. That is beyond the realm of possibility, certainly at this stage. However, as a vehicle for what I would describe as broader foreign security policy collaboration, and potentially putting in the direction of much more intimate intelligence sharing between these governments, then I think it has a broader strategic potential. And also it became an engine room for actually driving a new economic agenda in the Indo-Pacific region, given the protectionism that we've seen evident in both American politics and in Indian politics, then frankly it will start to add up as a significant net strategic advantage for Australia. But we must be realistic both about the opportunities and the limitations.
I'm interested too in what you might think, how China might respond. You describe how they've shown fairly diplomatic disdain for the Quad. Now they're a little bit more concerned about it. What's the next level for them in terms of trying to counter it?
Well, recently I've been writing on this subject in a job I normally am fully engaged with in the United States in New York, which is running the Asia Society. Our think tank focuses a lot on US-China relations. We've been analysing Chinese responses to the Quad as well. Initial disdain because they have seen this thing ebb and flow over the years. Then a predisposition to probably divide and conquer, which is to use the Australian government as an example, that if you become too, as it were, strategically aligned against Beijing, then various forms of economic punishment will be meted out to you. And then we see this further evolution in the Chinese policy position, as we've traced it in looking at Chinese language and behaviours around the region, around the world, which is to launch a full frontal political, diplomatic and rhetorical attack on the Quad as undermining multilateralism and undermining the UN order. That's currently where the game is up to in terms of China's reaction. But I still sense that nothing is ever permanent in terms of Chinese tactical direction. China has always shown itself to be tactically nimble. The big strategic card which China continues to have in its back pocket is this: the simple size of its economy, the economic leverage which it can deploy in relation to governments and countries right across the wider region and in Europe, if they were tempted at some stage to expand the Quad on a more global basis. And China's ability to therefore use that economic lever against more economically vulnerable countries, I think will be what China ultimately banks its negotiating position on.
Could you see China deciding to go for greater militarization as a response to this concern about the Quad?
I think the first interest which China has is to arrest the further expansion of the Quad abroad. The second is the one you've just pointed to in your question, which is on the part of military hardliners within the Chinese establishment, and many are now military hardliners, but not all. The manifestation of the Quad also therefore presents Chinese military planners looking at worst-case scenario planning, for example, over Taiwan, and now have to factor in scenarios involving potentially multiple other countries, Quad members. Whether that was materially going to be the case or not is a separate question. So it therefore begins to generate a further acceleration in China's arms purchases and its own military development. Of course, it's been developing militarily rapidly in recent decades, but the Chinese have looked carefully at what happened with the Soviet Union, the overinvestment of the military and the underinvestment of the civilian economy, ultimately undermining the sustainability of the Soviet system in the 1980s. They don't want to repeat that mistake. But if they sense a big combined adversary through the agency of the Quad or the Quad Plus, then you can easily trace a scenario whereby the ask by the military for a greater budget across both conventional and nuclear weapons would therefore increase.
Canada is another country that's come in for the ire of China. We've seen 2 Canadian nationals receiving very harsh penalties. How do you counter it? Should we be looking at, should they be looking at stuff like boycotting the Beijing Games as a way of punishment, as a way of international protest?
Well, each of these legal cases involving what the Canadians refer to as the 2 Michaels, and of course the other Canadian citizen who has been convicted now of a capital offence for drug importation into China. Each of these individual cases is different. And of course, we can only discuss them in the context of the retaliatory action which China undertook in the case of the 2 Michaels, in the frame of the arrest of Madame Meng from Huawei, and the case launched by the United States against Huawei, which required the Canadian government to then, as it were, allow the arrest of Madame Meng on Canadian soil and her detention in order to face charges under American law and operationalizing the bilateral legal agreement between Ottawa and Washington. So it's a very complex legal minefield. I'm quite disturbed that we've seen this very lengthy sentence given to the first of the two Michaels announced in China in the last 24 hours. I hope there will be a greater cause for leniency for the second. And I hope still further that some arrangement can be made in order to, shall we say, manage these legal cases in a way which sees, frankly, the two Michaels able to be returned to their own country.
Good to talk to you, Kevin Rudd. Thank you very much for your time.
Good to be with you.